Welcome to today's special webinar on the common federated access to NIH. We'll be talking today about a community update on MFA and identity requirements. Thanks everybody for joining. Next slide. So my name is Ann West. I serve as the AVP for Trust and Identity for Internet 2. Just wanted to do a few logistics before we get going. This event is being recorded, and we will be posting the slides and the recording on the Common Federation website after this session is over. We would like to hold questions until the end of our talk, but please post them in the Q&A, and we will track those as we go along. The chat area is available for your use to post comments for the group and have a side discussion. So next slide. We have over 200 folks on this registered for this webinar. Again, thanks for joining. Let's look at who you all are. I see folks from the far north in the Upper Peninsula, Michigan, and maybe south of Florida, or though University of Texas system is on the call, so we might have folks from Brownsville, not sure who's farther south. But from the west, we have folks from Hawaii, and then I'd say the individuals that get the gold star are our friends in Padua, Italy. So welcome everybody again. Next slide. And for those who are following along at home and have been over the last few years, some of this will be a review. But basically, our speaker, Jeff Erickson, will talk a little bit about where we started with this conversation, what's happened in the last few years, and with the ask that National Institutes of Health have made of the Uncommon community, what you all have done, how you've responded, as well as then looking ahead at the next steps for what National Institutes of Health need from us as a community. And we will have an extended period of time for questions and answers, discussion, and so forth, as well as some resources at the end. So looking forward to learning more about you, what your questions are, and where NIH is going. Next slide. And our primary speaker here is Jeff Erickson. He's the Chief of Identity and Access Management at National Institutes of Health. He'll provide an overview of all of the talk that we just talked about. Also joining with us is Tom Barton, who's in Commons research consultant, has been leading community and our work with National Institutes of Health for the last several years. So without further ado, gonna pass the baton over to Jeff. Thank you.
Thank you, Ann. Next. So as we were preparing these slides, maybe it's COVID brain or something, I kept going back. No, it couldn't have been. It was really in the middle of the pandemic when we started all this, and it was really 2 years ago. I believe that last bullet on the previous slide that I presented at an IAM Online webinar in April 2021 on this same topic, at which we talked about an ask from the NIH where regard to the internet, in Internet 2 in common community and all of you to meet 3 requirements that we had for federated access and really trying to move the bar forward. Next. The first had to do with sending us some basic user information when people logged in. And under the covers, that really boils down to adopting the R&S entity category. So that really, the basic information is really just 4 things. It's that persistent unique identifier for the person, their name, their email, their affiliation. So that was one requirement that we had. Next. The second was, and the flag we put in the ground was that we really wanted to start adopting federated MFA, where for those of you who run your own MFA systems, we had a system, and I'll talk more about that in a second, that was moving to require MFA, and it's used by researchers across the country and around the world. So we were hoping to adopt the ReFed's MFA profile for multi-factor authentication. Next, and the third requirement that remains still to be achieved, I'd say, has to do with having federated identity assurance claims sent when the person logs in. So since you are the credential service provider for the people logging in, you know who they are, and the ask was that you tell us how sure are you of the identity of the person. Another way to think about this under the covers is this is about adopting the ReFed's assurance framework. So next, so zooming out, back in 2020, the CIO from NIH at the time, Andrea Norris, and the CIO from the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, Mike Tartakovsky, came to a global exchange and really said, we need help from the community. I followed that up with a briefing that in the fall of 2020, and then again in that April 2021 IAM online webinar to be more specific about what it was we were looking for around those three requirements that I just laid out. In the fall of 2021 was when the Electronic Research Administration System, ERA, became the first system here at NIH to require MFA for external collaborators to connect to. Now, they're first and foremost, they adopted a service from the General Services Administration called login.gov for people to log in using MFA. But in September of 2021 was when we started, ERA started accepting federated MFA that you provided, and I'll say more about that in a second. And so here we are, 2023. We've made a ton of progress, and I'm here to resurrect the ask, much of which remains the same. Next. So here's some data regarding what you, how you answered the call, the ask that we put out there. You can see on the far right that as of about 2 months ago, in February 2023, researchers from about 204 unique domains were logging into the ERA system with MFA. And go back to the far left where you see in September 15th, 2021 was when ERA began accepting federated MFA. So we've had an increase of what, 50 odd institutions have joined that, have started providing the RNS entity category and supporting the ReFed's MFA profile since September 2021, where you see that steepest climb. That was the big response to the call to action that we had there in April and the previous October, that you see that steep climb of the number of institutions that went from 0 to just shy of 150 in a very short order. Next. So I can't go further without saying thank you. I mean, on behalf of everyone at NIH and the system owners at ERA, among other places across NIH, thank you. It goes without saying, but I'll say it anyway. We could not have done this without you. And while I'm on a thank you slide, I do want to say thank you to Anne and Tom and April and a whole bunch more people at Internet2 and the In Common Federation for all of their help and support. Literally, we couldn't, none of us, not you, not we at NIH, could have done this without their help. So thank you, Anne and Tom and April and Albert and others. Next. So next I want to talk a little bit about, that's where we've been, and let's see how things have been going. Next. Actually, there are about 350 institutions that have connected to the test site that we set up that allows you to test, do you receive the signals that we send, asking for the ReFed's MFA profile and responding. It is a little bit interesting that about not quite half of those, only about 200 of those were actually being used as of that April date on that previous graphic that I showed, and we'll say more about that in a second. But this is a good number in some, by any accounts, that many of you have adopted the ReFeds MFA profile. You've shown that you can use it. Next. So in terms of what that means, next. You delivered. I showed that on that earlier graph where there's that steep climb in 2021, and then a steadily increasing climb as you've continued to adopt, but that 350 number is a good number. Next. The good news, though, is that this has been good for the NIH, and I think hopefully it's been good for your institutions as well, in terms of reducing security risks, providing easy to use credentials that your researchers are used to. The bad news is that it seems that perhaps not all of your researchers know that they could use their local MFA to log in, and I'll say more about that in a second. And another way of saying that is that your researchers are using login.gov credentials at a greater rate than they are using the capabilities that you set up for them. And that's part of what we wanted to talk about today. Next. So here's some additional numbers to give you, and some of these are directly related to what we're talking about. Some of them tee up some of what's still to come. Next. So this pie chart shows the use of federated login here at the NIH, and that piece of the pie, the greenish color, is the MFA logins to ERA. And the numbers here are individuals. These are people logging in over the time period October 2022 to March 2023. So in the last 6 months, about almost 16,000 people have logged into ERA using federated MFA. You see that there's an order of magnitude more people who are using single factor login, federated login with your credentials, logging into other systems here at the NIH, non-ERA systems. So there are a couple messages here. One in particular is that you can see that as NIH continues to move forward, as many of those other systems, those grayish area systems, begin to adopt MFA and begin to require identity assurance assertions, the need for support for the MFA profile and the ReFeds assurance framework, there is clearly a need, because there are 200,000 people over the course of 6 months who are using federated credentials to log into our systems. Another thing, that piece on the right is an indication of where those people are coming from. So it's just over 1,400 institutions that those 220,000 people are coming from. So that exceeds INCOM in itself. This truly represents the global use of federated login. Again, this is only that green sliver is the federated MFA. The lion's share of the logins are still single factor, not using the MFA profile. Next. Here's another way to look at what we've accomplished, and in some respects, what we still have to do. So this is showing the percentage of people using federated MFA to log in specifically to ERA. So this is specifically about the ask, and the bars are laid out left to right. Is on the left-hand side, the stack bar is it's the institutions based on the amount of funding they receive from NIH. So most funding is received by the stacked bars, or the bars on the left-hand side. Least funding is over on the right-hand side as you go left to right. And then part of what you see here is that when you see this, if there's that one in the middle that's just over 25%, that means that 25% of the people from that organization, when logging into ERA, 25% are using the federated MFA capability that that organization set up. That means that the other 75% are using login.gov. Way over on the right, it looks like we've got one that more than 50%, maybe that's 60%, 55% of their users are logging in with the university's MFA capabilities. But that yellowish line there at the bottom shows the average, which is at about 10%. The implication being that for most of you, for every one person who's using federated MFA that you set up, there are 9 who are not. And those 9 are using login.gov because ERA requires MFA at this time. Next. So, how can you support going forward? What do we still have to do? Next. Three things, or the same 3 things that we talked about a couple years ago: supporting the MFA profile, supporting the Refeds assurance framework, and maybe this is a new one, actually encouraging the use of the federated MFA. One that is might be in invisible ink here is, of course, the table stakes is the RNS entity category, that basic information. We can't function without that. Next. So in terms of what's in it for you, I hope you realize there is something in it for you. Next. I'm not going to read all of these things, but in sum, I'd say it improves security. Your passwords are not uniquely being used here or for login to systems here at the NIH. By relying on you to do the MFA for us, that means that we simply get the assertion that you know who the person is, and that's good enough for us, and we're happy to federate in that way. Usually in spaces like this, the user experience is also positive. The idea that somebody can use the same credential that they use every day to access the systems that are available on your campus, that's also a good thing. Next. So here's where we start getting into what can we do going forward. And there is still some action that we can all take. Next. Again, I won't read all of this, but there is a journey that still lies ahead. And I'll summarize it, and I'll highlight a couple different things here. One is that we're not done. Not only that 1 in 10 people are using the federated MFA, that's an indication that there's still more work to do. Another piece I'll call attention back to is that pie chart where we have so many systems that are still only doing MFA or single factor authentication. That is bound to change, and that as more and more systems here at the NIH begin to require multi-factor authentication, having all of you already positioned to support it helps your researchers, helps you, helps us. Another piece, though, that it has been a requirement. I think it's going to begin to get some legs here at the NIH in the not too distant future. I wish I could give you dates, but unfortunately I don't have them. Has to do with that identity assurance assertion. And that goes back to that Refeds assurance framework, which is about having you tell us how certain you are about the identity of the person is going to become more and more and more important. And I will point out, and this is noted there in that last text, is that this isn't just an NIH thing. Other federal agencies have many of the same requirements that we do as federal agencies, and this bit about identity assurance and multi-factor authentication are table stakes in many respects for access to our systems from the internet. And so you will begin seeing not only from us, but from other agencies as well, who are part of the In Common Federation, this call for assertions about how well do you know who the person is, as well as the MFA piece. Again, the user experience of all of this should be good for your researchers, as well as for you, as well as for us on the receiving end of this, since, as I said before, researchers will use the credentials that they use all the time. Another piece that I do want to say is that we're not trying to dictate what people have to do here. This is about choice, where login.gov is one option. ERA is quite happy to continue to support and accept login.gov credentials. They are just as happy to accept the federated MFA that you would do. It's up to the researcher to pick which one is more convenient to them if we give them that choice, right? So by supporting the federated MFA and the ReFeds assurance framework, that helps give your users choice about what they want to do, rather than, well, the only way to get in is if you have this thing. Next. So we do have some next steps, all of us, not just we at NIH, mostly around continuing to work on federated MFA and the identity assurance claims. Also about giving choice to our users and advertising the choices that are available to them. And then in addition, the federal standards in this space around identity assurance in particular are changing at the moment. There's a new draft standard that the National Institute of Standards and Technologies, NIST, has released, and that people are commenting on it right now. And so another thing that we in this federation can do is look at how to align the requirements in that standards document, which again apply to us first and foremost in the federal government, but also how those tie in and align with the ReFeds assurance framework. One thing I glossed over before, it was on one of those earlier slides, and at one of the it was in one of those 2 years ago webinars that we gave. One of my co-presenters made the point at the time, this isn't just about you and the university community or the research institution community connecting to NIH. This is actually about collaboration among all of you as well. It's not just between you and NIH. That what you do in supporting all of these standards then facilitates the access that your researchers might need to their collaborators at a university across the country or across the world. Next. So our ask is, join us, don't wait, lead now. Next. And one thing that I do want to hear as we get into questions here, because that's it for me talking at you. We would like to hear what we at the NIH specifically can do to support you in your efforts to help us, because you are helping us as well as helping your own researchers. But what do you need from us? How can we help you? And what additional information might you need? What might we need to know that we don't? That sort of thing. And with that, next, we'll pause for some Q&A. And there are, by the way, as Ann said, you will get all these slides. Tom previewed there is a slide in here that's got a bunch of resources that are available to you about all of these topics. All of those are hyperlinks that you can go and read more about them, including that one in the middle on the right, the Get NIH Ready, is an old post that talks about how to, what you need to do on your side and how you can test. Are you ready to support the REFED's MFA profile and assurance framework that we now require, at least through this test site and for ERA? But we can back up, talk about, and I'll stop talking. We can take questions.
Great, thanks, Jeff. So we do have a few questions that have come in, and I thought it might be better to answer some of these verbally. Anthony Carvalhosa said, are we able to get individual and metrics for our institution as to who is logging in using Federated MFA and login.gov? So I'm wondering, Tom, you want to take that one and see what folks can get, what kind of information they can get?
I'm sorry, Anne, I was dealing with an issue. Could you rephrase the question?
So it's in the Q&A. Are people able to get individual metrics about their institutions and who's logging in with login.gov and Federated MFA?
It is. I actually have that data. I think you can. There's an email address we're going to give before we're done. help@incommon.org. That question and any other question you may have precipitated by this webinar and this discussion today. So welcome at help@incommon.org. If you just say in there, hey, I'd like to see basically that slide about, with my name plugged in, my institution's name, I'm happy to do that.
Sounds good. So it looks like Tom Jordan asked a similar question. So yeah, send us a note and send us a note at help@incommon.org and we can help you with that. So Mehdi Ramdain, my apologies if I'm kind of messing up your name here. Apologies for that. Is there a plan to add EduPerson assurance attribute to verify compliance with the REFED's LOA to the compliance check published at federation.nih.gov?
I can try that one as well if you'd like. So the compliance check currently, and has for some time, checked for the EduPerson. Let me back up. Jeff has been talking about the REFED's assurance framework and claims. You want letting them know how confident you are, the campus identity provider, in the identity of the person who's logging in. And REFED's assurance framework provides a framework for providing the information. All of the information provided via the REFED's assurance framework is transmitted inside the on the wire. There's the Federation protocol, and there's an attribute in there called EduPerson Assurance, a multi-valued attribute. And it's various of its values are defined by the REFED's assurance framework. So it is required for that to be, so that is added to the compliance check. It does test for the basic assertion, the kind of, the bar, you must be this tall to get on the ride kind of a thing, which is basically met by everyone. It really reflects the baseline expectations in the Common Federation for identity providers. So I hope that's a full answer. Betty, if I haven't quite gotten all of your question, I hope you'll write a follow-up.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. We also have a question about Get NIH Ready and keeping that wiki site, so it's an InCommon wiki site, up to date. And absolutely, I think that's a really great suggestion. And at the end of this session, we'll be asking you about your needs for more information, and we'll be updating that site accordingly, given what you mentioned on the webinar. So really, thanks for making that suggestion, Philip. Let's see, Dan Malone. Hello, Dan. To build that chart, you must know who on my campus is using login.gov rather than our campus credentials. Can NIH contact those people and suggest strongly they use Federated Login instead? Can we know where our campus falls on that chart? We can certainly give you the question, you answer your last question, Dan, about where you fall on that chart. We've charted out, I think it's the first 40 organizations, but we can certainly give you a sense of where you fall on that in that 200. But Jeff, your thoughts about, can NIH contact those folks and suggest strongly that they use Federated Login? What's your thought about that?
So honestly, I don't think that's going to happen. At least not with respect to ERA. ERA is their requirement is multi-factor authentication. And as I alluded to before, it's all about choice. They don't really have a preference whether people use their federated credential or login.gov. And so it's unlikely that ERA is going to come out and say, we strongly recommend that you stop using this thing that 9 out of 10 of you are using and instead use this other thing. That said, there is still hope from the standpoint of all of those other systems that were on that one pie chart that I presented that we haven't yet turned on MFA for, that is likely to come. And those become opportunities for people to, where we set them up for federated MFA, and they may or may not, login.gov may or may not, in many cases might not meet their needs. It does for ERA, but it won't necessarily for many of the other systems that we run, which means that the MFA option, primary MFA option that they're going to get is the federated MFA one. So rather than a message from NIH that strongly encourages one or the other, I think what you're more likely to see is you've got choices, and you can use this or you can use that, but which one you're prompted to provide may depend on what you're connecting to.
And I wonder if I could kind of jump in on this too, Dan. I understand that I take as a basis for your question is that it's not trivially easy for you to contact those folks or know what they're doing. And I get that. And you might not even have the data. Not certainly, you don't have data showing when they use a login.gov credential, you wouldn't be privy to that. No. But as Jeff was indicating, we're talking about the NIH now, and even when we're talking about the NIH, we've just established a toehold with regard to all of the different systems across NIH. And that's going to be expanding both for MFA and then following along eventually identity assurance. And so over and over again, your researchers, whoever they are, will be receiving messages from some of those NIH systems as they begin to implement their MFA and identity assurance requirements. When they get to that point, they'll be messaging their users, I would expect, right? That would be the usual thing for them to do. And we're hoping that we'll be able to ensure that those messages represent all of the options available to those researchers. But it would be also great if there was a way on each campus for there to be an internal communication to let researchers of all sorts know that they have this option, that the campus, the central IT have developed the capability for them to meet these requirements when you have done so, as pretty much everyone here has for MFA. And other agencies outside of the NIH, as Jeff also indicated, are heading down this path on their own schedules. We don't know deadlines, and there is no federal government-wide deadline that being imposed, but there's all the processes and incentives are being set up to drive adoption of these things in some period of time, months to years, not longer time frames, I would say. So it would be really great if you can figure out how to get the message to the people that support your researchers on your campus or something like that to complement whatever else they may hear from agencies or others outside of your campus talking to them.
Yeah, it's both really good points. We have kind of it's not quite a follow-on conversation, but our question is more around the internal efforts, Jeff, that NIH is making around kind of working with your service providers to align how you handle local credentials. Paul Erickson asks, can you talk a bit more about efforts to encourage adoption across NIH, especially to address this type of perception that pushes back against adoption?
Yeah.
So he's
Paul, yeah. We must be related. I saw your question there. I'm a little. I'm not sure how to respond because I'm a little surprised that there's a perception that systems here have or require local credentials, because I am not aware of that. I know there are some. I do think that there is a movement among some of those systems, at least, away from the local credentials that they have. But for the most part, at least the systems that we support, we don't support local credentials. They're using the ones that I and my team support it's around, at least for external people, it's all around federated credentials. So I guess what I might ask is if you have some specifics, if you can send us some names afterwards of ones that you hear about, we'd be happy to go and look at those. There wasn't that long ago, was it last year, we were on a big MFA push for NIH staff, and we had about 400 public facing systems that required login. Our focus was on for enforcing MFA for the NIH people logging into those sites from the internet, and we did that. I think one of the next things in the course of doing that, I might have seen a couple of the ones that you're talking about that had their own local stores, but after we spoke with them, I think many of them might not have been aware this is an internal thing on our part. They weren't aware that we had capabilities that would allow them to use the federated credentials, and they could get out of the business of trying to maintain those local accounts. So we're more than happy to continue to drive that effort internally. If I could, I noticed a couple of questions in the chat that we may not, there were a couple, I think, on the theme of can we share with you the user details of people in your organizations who are using login.gov credentials so that you could reach out to them. I can't say yes or no to that today, but what I will say is that we're going to capture all of these requests and we can take them back for internal discussion. In particular, I think we'll have to work with the ERA team specifically on that one. We know, but there's a permissions thing here as well. And I'm sure our privacy people are going to want us to answer some questions about can we use this information for that, but be all that as it may. We'll take all of these questions back and discuss them internally. And if there's anything more we can do, we certainly will, if it helps you promote the federated MFA that we're calling for in particular.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely pulling these back and feeding them into kind of the next steps for how we're going to encourage the community and help the community to adopt. Bruce Vincent asked, would it be possible to get more details regarding NIH's IM architecture and software used in support for supporting multilateral federation implementation?
Sure. Not from me. But I see that my colleagues who know everything are also on the call. I don't know if one of them wants to come off mute and try and give a brief summary for what our architecture is and how we've enabled what it is that we're doing. Sandeep or Sumit, you want to give it a try? Michael, if you know. Putting them on the spot.
They might not be able to speak. They're not a panel, so it's possible whether they're probably frantically pressing and unpressing their lead button with no effect.
Okay.
I think it's a really good point. Yeah. And we can certainly, we're getting enough questions. We might want to do an FAQ with a bunch of these questions, answer them, update the Get NIH Ready site, and include possibly some information, Jeff, to answer that last question, or maybe we have office hours or something. So yeah, again, Bruce will figure out how we get that information to you.
Yeah, so that would probably be a better subject for a discussion all on its own, because I'm sure there's a lot of back and forth that you could have with with our technical team, but also I suspect that helping each other, there's a lot that could come out of a conversation about that.
Yeah. I'm going to stop a little bit and ask April to put up the first poll. We have a couple polls here to kind of gauge. Now we know kind of where you're all from, sort of what you've done in your institution to actually support this. So the first poll is really around the NIH requirements that Jeff went over at the very beginning, that has to do in particular with access to ERA, so the grants management system. So when you're looking at this, think about, yes, I supported the September 2021 access to ERA requirements. Great, yeah, so pretty good there. While y'all are filling that out, I'm gonna move to a question from Scott Cantor, and then we'll go back to that poll. Scott says it's one thing to pass EduPerson assurance and say this is self-asserted identity, but my question is when or which apps are actually going to expect us to have business processes to assert higher LOA. That is doubly relevant given the recent disclosures about login.gov. So thoughts about that, Jeff?
Yeah, so when it comes to the ERA system, they've seen the news reports about login.gov too, and they continue to be okay with MFA from login.gov. Those in that pie chart again, those light gray, white, the big number of NIH systems that accept federated login, I won't say federated MFA because they're not doing federated MFA yet. Those are the ones that are, as we transition, they are more likely even than ERA to have this requirement for an identity assurance. And it's squishy right now, especially given that NIST standards are changing, or they're proposed to change. We don't know when the new version of the standard is actually going to be finalized, but there's more to do in that space. I think we're in terms of timing. I mean, honestly, it's already April. Since we don't have a specific system that I'm aware of yet that has said, I want this done by September, the way ERA did 2 years ago, or by December. Honestly, I don't think that it's going to happen this year. But then again, things can change in an hour. If something happens or somebody comes out and says, I want this done and I want it done right away. The good news from my perspective is we can all do that. We've shown that we can, right? And even if that assurance is asserting, if we NIH accept the risk that an assertion from all of you of a local enterprise level of assurance of who the person is, you know the person well enough that you give them access to your higher value assets, we could say, well, for now that's good enough, right? That if it's good enough for them, it's good enough for us in the near term, while we collectively as a community work on some of these other standards, and as you say, tying into whatever local business processes you have for actual identity verification and hooking those up into your IDPs. So that's a long-winded non-answer in some respects. I don't have dates. I don't have a system. I don't have a specific answer about our need for you to have business processes tied in. To me, the good news remains that we have the infrastructure in place, we have the standards in place that we could adopt those almost at any time. I think if you're plugged in to support the federated MFA that we set up.
Hey, Eric, Jeff, let me ask you a kind of a follow-up to this. It also is kind of crossing a number of the questions here, which is that we don't have a deadline for the next thing and what that next thing is. But let me ask, and this is going to be a little bit speculative, given the kinds of interactions you and your team have with all of those other services out around NIH, what do you have a sense for what kind of lead time you might, how far in advance might you become aware that something is going to come down the pike? And then, of course, we can pretty quickly turn that kind of information around and let the income community know what we know at that time.
You know, I wish I could ask the audience as well on my team. I mean, honestly, it can be as short as 2 weeks, because the reason I say that is because that's generally how long it takes us if we've seen something before, from start to finish, including all of the development, all of the testing. We can do it faster. Generally, it takes 2 weeks because it's not on our side, it's on the service provider side. So it could be as quick as 2 weeks. Now, I will say that there may, given where we are and the fact that we haven't yet had a system step up and say, I need federated identity assurance claims, that we would have to then have a conversation with them about, well, we're not actually getting them yet, and there's some questions out there in the community about what would be an okay claim level coming from the institutions that would meet your needs. But what is that? That 2 weeks might drag into 2 months to have some back and forth. And I'm sure you can count that you and Ann and others would be getting emails from us saying, uh-oh, we just got a request for this and they want it done yesterday. So it could turn around pretty quickly. Generally, for some of this, it's as much driven by how much we can get out locally and promote some of these things among our service providers as anything else. But you never know. They can come out of the woodwork this afternoon.
Yeah, that's always the trick. It's hard to get these projects on the front burner without a deadline.
Yeah.
And yet there's the possibility that there won't be enough lead time when we kind of do know what the deadline is.
Yeah,
So,
excuse me, Tom, and I think the good news is that I think that was around 2021, there was an in-common group underneath the Community Trust and Assurance Board called the Assured Access Working Group. And they put together a set of kind of early best practices, I could say, or early practices about how to look at the research, the ReFed's assurance framework and implement the request that NIH had. So, you know, that is a really good resource, and we'll have that in the list at the end. I also wanted to, though, launch another poll, April, if you would be willing. This one is more around the communication of the NIH requirements and what y'all did to get that out there. Have researchers, so researchers are aware. I noticed there's a couple of comments in the Q&A. Mark Day, for instance, said, is it possible that the user experience with ERA is driving registrations being login.gov rather than federated logins? I think we've had a similar conversation internally about that. If you go to the ERA page, and I really appreciate you pointing that out. As Jeff said, we can take this information and your perceptions of this process and how to make it easier for researchers back to ERA and have a conversation with them. So I think this is really great. Let's say Michael Geddes asks, does login, gosh, I can't talk today, login.gov charge NIH for a number of external users or logins authenticating to NIH applications?
They do. It's not very much, and in fact, I think it was suspended. The charges were suspended, so it's free for right now. I think they gave us a 2-year pass I don't know why, but we can all read into why. I think the question right above that is also tangentially related. That idea that user experience with ERA is driving the login.gov adoption. I think that is 100% true. That ERA was first to be promoting login.gov. Login.gov was available for MFA before the federated MFA option was, and ERA was going full steam ahead promoting MFA for logging into MFA. And so it was one of those, they got there first. And now how do people switch, right? And that question, I don't know the answer to that. But I think there's a process, and we're going to have to work with the ERA team on how we can facilitate that. Again, going back to that giving people choice of if they are now using and feel stuck using the login.gov credential and they'd love to switch over to your university one, but they don't know how. That's something that we need to work on internally. But I think both of those things are the fact that GSA isn't charging us at the moment makes it a viable option. You're not charging us either, so that's good.
And for what it's worth, I recall that ERA on their site somewhere claimed that it's possible to associate a different credential with your ERA account or whatever your access there. But I don't believe there is a self-service automated workflow. You may have to actually, press the help button or whatever. There's some manual steps involved currently. But I think, Jeff, your point is, it would be good to make that get it to a point where that's self-serve, where the user, they have the choice and they have the tools to implement their choice without having to involve anybody else.
Yep.
Be perfect.
Yeah, and you can see from the poll, looks like a number of folks did the integration, but didn't necessarily communicate with the researchers. Some did, and of course, many don't know, which is understandable. So that might be something that we can help with. So the last poll, April, if you'd be willing to put that up, is more around what types of information you might need to move forward on this. So we've included kind of the major points that Jeff talked about, and just to see, are there further community engagement pieces and opportunities that we can put out there to help you all. So the other one, so the attribute information release has to do with the research and scholarship piece that Jeff talked about, multi-factor, the MFA, ReFed's MFA profile, and then the identity proofing is the ReFed's assurance framework piece. Yeah, so it looks like a fair amount of folks in looking at the identity proofing, understandably. So Jeff, you talked a little bit about other federal agencies looking at this. Can you tell me a little bit more about kind of what's driving all this and what they're looking at? Are they looking at a similar kind of approach to supporting MFA or login.gov or both?
I'm sorry, the other agencies or
the other agencies, yeah.
Yeah, so we haven't talked to every agency in the federal government, but we have had conversations with some of our colleagues at NSF and DOE headquarters, not the national labs. But the thing that's driving for them, the drivers for them are the same drivers for us, and that is the federal standards that are baked in to our authorization and accreditation processes that we have to go through to get permission to operate our systems. And the technical controls that they ask us to implement tie back to that standard that I saw Ben posted in the chat this link to the special publication 863. I see that one is to the letter C. There are actually 4 pieces to that document. There's an unlettered version, which is the umbrella, and then there's an A, B, and C. A talks about the identity assurance. B talks about authenticator assurance, the like MFA, and C talks about the interfederation federated assurance level, the connecting our systems to each other. But generally speaking, what we see, and the thing that's driving a lot of this for us here at NIH, as well as over at NSF and DOE, and I'm sure it's true at USDA and within DOD and other granting agencies, is that for our systems, we're required to implement controls that include, and then they say, go see that other special publication, that one, the 863. So as that changes, our requirements change. And that's what's generally speaking driving all of this.
All right, thanks. And I know that, and someone put in the chat room about 863-4, the new version that's out for public comment, which I think is now closed. There was a in-common community set of feedback that was sent to NIST around that, in particular related to the federated access portion. So we also, the in-common community also tracks that too, for this probably similar, different reasons, but good interoperability is always our kind of our goal. So one thing, Tom, is you're answering questions, wondering if you could put up that last slide, or the resources slide where we.
Yes, I can. Yes, I can. I can tell myself I can. If I can tell myself I can do it, I can do it. From current house, do you see it?
We
No.
don't.
I didn't. I see. I skipped a step. Yes, I can. I skipped that button there. How's that?
There you go.
Perfect.
And again, one of the things that we've talked about is actually for all of you that are on this, have registered for this particular webinar, putting together an opt-in for an email list or ability to have a conversation and to learn more about the NIH work. You can always put a watch on the wiki page. That's a really great way of doing that too. But understanding a little bit more and more nuances around what your needs are might be a really good thing for us to engender in another way. If you have thoughts about that, you can certainly post it in the chat or send it to help@incommon.org, and we'll look to see how we can engage you all in a more timely fashion around these changes. So with that, I'd like to thank you all for joining, and thank you so much, Jeff, and your crew on the call.
Thank you, everybody.
For providing a really great update. And thanks, Tom, for your, as always, illuminating answers. So thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
Thanks.